A doctor humiliates his black colleague, unaware that his patient is an influential person ready to turn everything upside down. What will happen when the truth comes to light? Comment below with how you would react and where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to catch more stories about justice and change. Raymond Hopkins had always dreamed of becoming a surgeon in one of the top hospitals in the country. A young black doctor, he had graduated at the top of his class from medical school, driven by both ambition and a deep sense of responsibility to represent those who had come before him and pave the way for those who would follow. Inspired by the stories of groundbreaking black physicians who had broken barriers and made history, Raymond was determined to make his mark. With a blend of pride, confidence, and a touch of nervousness, he stepped into the doors of St. Luke's Medical Center, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. The hospital was known for its excellent care and state-of-the-art facilities, but it was also known for its conservative culture and predominantly white staff. The gleaming halls of St. Luke's were lined with awards, plaques, and photographs of esteemed doctors and surgeons who had built their careers within its walls. Raymond was eager to prove himself, but he quickly sensed a certain coldness in the air. His first day felt like a test not just of his medical skills, but of his resilience, patience, and ability to navigate an environment that felt subtly hostile. Raymond's first impression of the hospital staff was mixed. As he approached the reception desk, he noticed the receptionist's eyes widen slightly when she saw him, before she quickly forced a smile. "Good morning, Dr. Hopkins. Welcome to St. Luke's," she said with a polite but distant tone. "You're expected in the administrative office for your orientation." He nodded, thanking her and heading down the hall, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. As he walked, he could feel the eyes of passing nurses and doctors on him, lingering just a second too long, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. He adjusted his tie, trying to shrug off the discomfort, but the sense of being an outsider was palpable. In the administrative office, Raymond was greeted by Dr. Margaret Thompson, the head of the department, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s with an air of authority. She shook his hand briefly, her grip firm, but her eyes cold. "Welcome, Dr. Hopkins," she said, her voice clipped. "We expect our doctors to maintain the highest standards here. I trust you're prepared to meet those standards." "Yes, Dr. Thompson. I'm looking forward to contributing to the team," Raymond replied, maintaining his composure despite the thinly veiled skepticism in her tone. "Good," she nodded, before launching into a lengthy explanation of hospital protocols, expectations, and routines. Raymond listened attentively, taking mental notes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already being judged more harshly than any of the other new hires. As Dr. Thompson went over the schedule, she mentioned that he would be working under Dr. Richard Allen, one of the most respected surgeons in the hospital. As Raymond left the administrative office, he made his way to the surgical wing, where he would be spending most of his time. The environment was bustling, filled with seasoned doctors, eager interns, and nurses rushing to and fro. Raymond tried to introduce himself to a few colleagues, but the responses were lukewarm at best. Some nodded curtly, while others gave him a quick once-over and then turned away. Undeterred, Raymond approached the nurses' station, where a small group was engaged in conversation. "Hi, I'm Dr. Hopkins," he introduced himself with a smile. The nurses exchanged glances before one of them, a tall woman with a badge that read Nurse Jessica, offered a half-hearted smile. "Welcome to the team, Dr. Hopkins. Hope you're ready for the pace here. It's not for everyone." Raymond chuckled lightly, masking his discomfort. "I think I'll manage. Looking forward to working with you all." But as he walked away, he could hear their hushed whispers resume behind him. It was clear that he had not been warmly received. As the day went on, Raymond finally met Dr. Richard Allen, the senior surgeon he would be working under. Dr. Allen was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a deep voice that carried authority. He was well respected in the hospital, not only for his surgical skills, but also for his demanding nature and strict adherence to traditional hierarchies. Raymond approached him with confidence, hoping to make a good first impression. "Dr. Allen, I'm Raymond Hopkins, the new surgical resident. It's a pleasure to meet you," he said, extending his hand. Dr. Allen barely glanced at him before shaking his hand with a quick, perfunctory grip. "Hopkins, right. I've read your file," he said, his tone indifferent. "We have a lot of work to do here, and we don't have time for mistakes. You'll be assisting me in surgery tomorrow. Make sure you're ready. We run a tight ship around here." Raymond nodded, his hand still hanging in the air for a moment before he pulled it back. "Yes, sir. I'm prepared and eager to learn." Dr. Allen gave a curt nod before turning away. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Raymond to hear. The brief exchange left Raymond feeling deflated, but he refused to let it dampen his spirits. He had faced adversity before and knew he would have to prove himself through his actions, not just words. He spent the rest of the day familiarizing himself with the hospital's layout, protocols, and surgical schedules, determined to be as prepared as possible for his first day in the operating room. Over the next few days, Raymond became more attuned to the subtle dynamics at play within St. Luke's. While he was always professional and polite, the responses he received from his colleagues ranged from indifferent to dismissive. In meetings, his suggestions were often brushed aside, only to be repeated by a white colleague minutes later and suddenly considered valuable. Raymond tried not to let it get to him, but he couldn't ignore the reality. Other new hires, most of them white, seemed to receive more support, more encouragement, and more inclusion in the hospital's tightly knit circles. He saw them chatting freely with senior doctors, getting advice, and forming mentor-mentee relationships. For Raymond, every interaction felt like walking on eggshells. One afternoon, during a particularly heated discussion about a surgical approach, Raymond presented a well-researched alternative based on recent medical studies. The room fell silent for a moment before Dr. Allen scoffed. "We don't have time for experiments, Hopkins. Stick to the protocols that have been working for decades." A few colleagues smirked, and Raymond felt a flush of frustration. It was clear his voice was not valued in the same way. Despite the growing sense of isolation, Raymond remained committed to his work. He arrived early, stayed late, and volunteered for the toughest assignments. He was determined to show through his actions that he was just as capable, if not more so, than any other doctor in the hospital. But he could not ignore the weight of the unspoken judgments and the feeling that he was constantly being watched, evaluated, and doubted. As the days went on, the tension within Raymond began to build. He could see that the road ahead was going to be a long and challenging one, but he was ready to fight for his place at St. Luke's. Little did he know, his resolve and patience were about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Raymond Hopkins quickly realized that his initial experiences at St. Luke's Medical Center were not just a matter of first-day jitters. The longer he stayed, the more he became aware of the systemic issues that plagued the hospital. What he had hoped were mere misunderstandings or isolated incidents revealed themselves to be patterns of exclusion, bias, and subtle undermining that went beyond simple oversight. Raymond's second week in the hospital began with a heavy workload. He had expected that as a new surgical resident, he would be given challenging tasks. After all, It was a high-pressure environment where only the best could thrive. However, it quickly became clear that his assignments were not just challenging, they were disproportionately difficult compared to his colleagues. "Hopkins, I need you to handle Mr. Thatcher in room 406, said Dr. Allen, with a dismissive wave of his hand during morning rounds. "He's got a history of non-compliance and aggressive behavior. Make sure you don't screw up his pre-op procedures." Raymond nodded, trying not to let the brusque tone affect him. Mr. Thatcher was notorious among the staff for being difficult. The other residents exchanged glances of sympathy, or perhaps relief that they weren't the ones assigned to him. For Raymond, this was yet another instance where he felt he was being tested more severely than his peers. He spent hours with Mr. Thatcher, enduring verbal abuse and hostile outbursts. But he maintained his professionalism and composure. Raymond knew that every step he took was being watched, and that any mistake, however minor, would be magnified. He double-checked every detail, ensuring that Mr. Thatcher was prepped perfectly for surgery. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but the procedure went smoothly, and Mr. Thatcher was stable post-op. Yet, instead of receiving recognition for handling a tough case, Raymond overheard Dr. Allen later that day, downplaying his work to another senior doctor. "Well, it's just basic care. Any of our residents should be able to handle it," he said dismissively. Raymond's encounters with Dr. Allen became more frequent and more confrontational. In meetings and during rounds, Raymond would present his cases meticulously, always ready to provide evidence and rationale for his decisions. However, he often found his input being dismissed or outright ignored. During one meeting about a complicated surgery for a high-profile patient, Raymond proposed a minimally invasive approach based on new research he had been studying. Dr. Allen, without even looking at the data, waved him off. "We're not here to play with textbooks, Hopkins. This isn't med school," he said, eliciting a few chuckles from other senior doctors. It was clear that Dr. Allen and others in leadership had preconceived notions about Raymond, perhaps due to his race, his youth, or his demeanor, that overshadowed his qualifications and contributions. Despite his best efforts, Raymond felt as though he was constantly swimming upstream against a current of biases that questioned his abilities at every turn. The microaggressions were frequent and insidious. They came in the form of offhand comments from his colleagues, like, "You speak so well for someone from your background," or, "I'm sure you got into med school because of diversity quotas." Each comment was like a small cut, seemingly minor but cumulatively exhausting. There were times when he would be in the break room, and conversations would abruptly halt when he entered. Other times he'd be standing in line for coffee, and a group of nurses or doctors would discuss their plans for the weekend, only to ignore him when he tried to join the conversation. More overt incidents happened too. One morning, a patient's family member explicitly asked for another doctor after seeing Raymond. The request was couched in vague terms. "We'd prefer someone with more experience." But it was clear what they meant. Raymond had seen it too many times not to recognize the signs. The charge nurse, trying to handle the situation, awkwardly apologized to him. "Sorry, Dr. Hopkins. It's just that some families, they have their preferences." Raymond simply nodded, his face impassive, though his chest tightened with frustration. He wished he could brush it off, but it stung every time. A reminder of the uphill battle he faced daily. The constant scrutiny and lack of support began to weigh heavily on Raymond. He was a competent doctor with fresh ideas and a genuine passion for his work. But here at St. Luke's, he felt isolated and undervalued. The psychological toll of being under constant judgment started to seep into his personal life. After one particularly grueling day, where he was berated by Dr. Allen for a mistake that wasn't his, Raymond called his mother. Her voice, warm and strong, had always been his anchor. "Mama, I'm trying so hard," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "But it feels like no matter what I do, they see me as less competent, less worthy, just less." His mother, a woman who had faced her own battles as a black nurse in a different time, spoke with the wisdom of experience. "Baby, you come from a long line of fighters. They'll see you how they want to see you, but you don't let that define who you are. You're there to be a great doctor, and no one gets to take that away from you. You hold your head high and keep doing what you know is right." Her words gave him strength, but the doubt lingered. Would he ever be fully accepted here? Would his work ever be valued on merit alone? Or would he always be seen through the lens of their biases? A few days later, Raymond was assigned to a difficult case involving a young girl who needed a complex surgery to remove a tumor. It was a case that required precision, creativity, and confidence, qualities Raymond knew he possessed. As he reviewed her charts and planned the procedure, he felt a sense of purpose reignite within him. During the surgery, he carefully navigated the complexities of the tumor's location, suggesting adjustments and techniques that deviated from the more traditional approaches favored by Dr. Allen. At one point, Dr. Allen, visibly irritated, snapped, "If you want to play lead surgeon, Hopkins, you better be ready to take the fall when things go wrong." Raymond, his voice calm but firm, responded, "I'm not here to take over, Dr. Allen. I'm here to make sure we do what's best for the patient. And this approach is the safest according to the latest studies." The surgery was a success, and the young girl's parents were overjoyed. But instead of commendation, Raymond was met with cold silence in the operating room. Dr. Allen didn't speak to him for the rest of the day, and Raymond knew that, yet again, his actions would be scrutinized under a different lens. That night, reflecting on his day, Raymond realized something crucial. He could not control how others perceived him, but he could control how he responded. He decided that he would not let their prejudices dictate his actions or his worth. He would continue to advocate for his patients and for himself, regardless of the hurdles. Raymond also began noticing that he was not the only one facing these challenges. He observed how the few other doctors and nurses of color were treated, subtly sidelined, overlooked for opportunities, and sometimes outright ignored. It was not just his battle. It was a systemic issue within St. Luke's, a culture deeply ingrained and resistant to change. He started discreetly speaking with some of the others, trying to build alliances and understand if there were ways to support each other. Many were hesitant to speak up, fearful of backlash or further marginalization. Still, Raymond sensed that there was a growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction that could no longer be ignored. He realized that if change was going to happen, it needed to be more than just about him. It had to be about everyone who felt marginalized, overlooked, and diminished. This awareness planted a seed in his mind, one that would continue to grow in the coming weeks. As Raymond's days at St. Luke's continued, the weight of his experiences settled heavily on his shoulders. But he was not ready to back down. He was beginning to see his situation not as a personal battle, but as a call to action. He knew he had to be smarter, more strategic, and more resilient than ever before. Little did he know, this internal shift in his perspective would soon align with external events that would force his hand and set the stage for an unexpected ally to step into the picture, changing the course of his career and the hospital forever. Raymond Hopkins had settled into a routine at St. Luke's Medical Center, albeit a challenging one filled with daily battles against overt and covert discrimination. His days were marked by arduous tasks, unfriendly stares, and moments of self-doubt. He was caught in a cycle of trying to prove himself while feeling constantly undermined. However, everything began to change with the arrival of a new patient, an elderly gentleman named Henry Walton. Henry Walton arrived at St. Luke's one rainy afternoon after a serious fall at his home had resulted in a complex fracture that required surgical intervention. He was in his late 70s, with a sharp, observant gaze and a calm, almost commanding presence. From the moment he was wheeled into the hospital, it was clear that he was not an ordinary patient. He spoke with a calm authority that suggested a life spent in positions of influence, though he gave little away about his personal history. Raymond was assigned as Henry's attending physician. As he reviewed Henry's medical history and prepared for their first meeting, he didn't expect much beyond the usual exchange of pleasantries and clinical information, but from the moment he stepped into Henry's room, he sensed something different. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walton. I'm Dr. Hopkins, and I'll be overseeing your care during your stay here," Raymond said, offering a professional smile as he entered the room. Henry looked up from his bed, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Dr. Hopkins," he repeated, his tone neutral, yet probing. "You're quite young to be in charge, aren't you?" Raymond chuckled softly, not missing the hint of challenge in the older man's voice. "I like to think of myself as experienced, not just young. But I assure you, you're in good hands." Henry's lips curled into a subtle smile. "We'll see about that," he replied. "I've seen a lot in my time, Doctor, and I've learned to trust actions over words." There was something in the way Henry spoke that piqued Raymond's curiosity. He wasn't like the other patients who either showed distrust outright or tried to be overly friendly to compensate for their biases. Henry seemed genuine, inquisitive, and, most of all, observant. Over the next few days, Raymond found himself visiting Henry's room more frequently than he did with his other patients. Not because Henry's condition was particularly complicated. His surgery had gone smoothly, and his recovery was on track, but because there was something about Henry that drew him in. The old man had a way of making one feel both comfortable and scrutinized at the same time. Henry would often ask Raymond about his background, his education, and what brought him to St. Luke's. At first, Raymond was cautious, answering only with what he deemed as necessary information. However, Henry's genuine interest slowly started to disarm him. "So, tell me, Dr. Hopkins," Henry began one morning as Raymond checked his vitals, "what's it like working here? I'm sure a place like St. Luke's must be quite the learning experience." Raymond hesitated for a moment, deciding how much he should reveal. "It's challenging, Mr. Walton," he said diplomatically. "I've had to adapt quickly, but that's part of the job, isn't it?" Henry chuckled, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he saw right through Raymond's guarded response. "Challenges are one thing, Doctor. Unnecessary obstacles are another. Sometimes the hardest part isn't the work itself, but the environment in which you do it." Raymond looked up, meeting Henry's gaze. It was the first time anyone in this hospital seemed to truly see the struggle beneath his professional demeanor. "That's an interesting way to put it, Mr. Walton," Raymond replied, his voice measured. "I suppose it can be like that, yes." As the days went by, their conversations grew deeper. Henry was not just a passive patient. He engaged Raymond in discussions about medicine, ethics, and the healthcare system. He asked pointed questions about Raymond's experiences, about his colleagues, and about the culture of the hospital itself. Raymond found himself opening up more than he had anticipated. "Do you feel like you're getting the respect you deserve here, Dr. Hopkins?" Henry asked one day, his tone casual, but his eyes intensely focused on Raymond's reaction. Raymond paused, carefully considering his words. "Respect is earned, Mr. Walton. But sometimes it feels like the bar is set a bit higher for some of us than for others." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you plan to overcome that? Or is this one of those times when you have to be twice as good to get half as far?" The phrase struck a chord with Raymond, echoing the words his mother had often said. "You could say that," he answered quietly, feeling a connection with this patient that went beyond the usual doctor-patient relationship. Henry's interest in Raymond wasn't just idle curiosity. He listened intently, and every time Raymond spoke about the subtle and not-so-subtle challenges he faced, Henry's expression grew more serious. There was a sense that Henry was processing every detail, every nuance, but he never pushed too hard. Henry began to observe the hospital's dynamics more closely. From his room, he could see how different staff members interacted, how decisions were made, and most importantly, how Raymond was treated compared to his colleagues. He noticed the side glances, the dismissive comments, and the palpable tension whenever Raymond was in the room with senior doctors. One afternoon, after watching a tense exchange between Raymond and Dr. Allen outside his room, Henry commented, "That one has it in for you, doesn't he?" Raymond turned to Henry, surprised by the directness of his observation. "Dr. Allen, he's a tough supervisor, but he's highly respected. Respected by some, perhaps, but I've seen how he looks at you, how he speaks to you. There's more to it than just tough love, I'd say," Henry replied, his tone measured but firm. Raymond wasn't sure how to respond. He knew Henry was right, but he had grown accustomed to keeping his guard up, not showing weakness or frustration. Yet there was something about Henry that felt safe, almost like speaking to a mentor who genuinely cared. Their relationship took a turning point one day when Raymond was visibly frustrated after yet another condescending remark from Dr. Allen during a meeting. He returned to Henry's room, needing to clear his mind. "Rough day, Doctor?" Henry asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Raymond sighed, dropping his professional mask for a moment. "You could say that. It's not easy trying to prove yourself when the deck feels stacked against you." Henry's expression turned somber. "You know, Dr. Hopkins, I've spent my life dealing with people like that. People who think they know your worth better than you do. The trick is not letting them define you. You have to define yourself." Raymond felt a surge of emotion, anger, frustration, but also a strange comfort. "And how do you do that, Mr. Walton, when it feels like every step forward is 2 steps back?" Henry leaned forward slightly. "You keep moving forward, no matter what. But sometimes you need someone who sees you for who you are, not who they think you should be." There was a long pause as Raymond absorbed his words. "I appreciate that, Mr. Walton," he finally said. "It's rare to feel seen around here." Henry smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Oh, I see you, Dr. Hopkins. And I think a lot of others will too, sooner or later." Henry's presence became a subtle but significant support for Raymond. He didn't have to say much. His presence alone became a quiet encouragement. Raymond found himself looking forward to their conversations, which were becoming the highlight of his otherwise grueling days. In the background, Henry continued to observe, taking mental notes of everything he saw, every slight, every dismissive comment, every unequal opportunity. He had a way of making small talk with the nurses and doctors who passed by his room, gathering information without anyone realizing it. It was as if he were piecing together a puzzle, and Raymond was the key. One day, Raymond entered Henry's room to find him engaged in a deep conversation with a senior nurse. As Raymond listened in, He realized that Henry was subtly steering the conversation toward the hospital's culture and practices. The nurse, perhaps unknowingly, began to reveal her frustrations with the way certain things were handled, including how newer doctors, particularly those of color, were often sidelined. Interesting, Henry mused, his voice calm but probing. Sounds like there's a lot of room for improvement around here. Raymond caught Henry's eye, and for a moment there was a silent understanding between them. Henry was not just a passive observer. He was gathering ammunition, quietly preparing for something. As the days went on, Raymond realized that Henry Walton was far more than just another patient. There was a depth to his questions, a purpose behind his words. And though Raymond didn't know exactly what Henry's intentions were, he began to feel a cautious sense of hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Little did he know, Henry's presence in the hospital was about to become a catalyst for a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of St. Luke's, exposing long-hidden prejudices and forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. The days at St. Luke's Medical Center seemed to pass in a blur for Raymond Hopkins. He continued to face the same obstacles, a combination of microaggressions, dismissive attitudes, and constant scrutiny. However, the growing rapport with Henry Walton, the mysterious elderly patient who seemed to be more aware of the hospital's internal dynamics than most, became a source of comfort. Henry had a way of making Raymond feel seen, heard, and understood in a way that no one else in the hospital did. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, where Raymond had been chastised by Dr. Allen in front of his peers for a mistake that wasn't even his fault, Raymond found himself back in Henry's room. His usual mask of professionalism was starting to crack. Henry noticed immediately. "Rough day, Doctor?" Henry asked, his tone gentle yet probing. Raymond let out a long breath. "You could say that," he replied, not even trying to mask the frustration in his voice. He had spent the entire day running from one difficult case to another, only to be reprimanded for something outside his control. "Sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never good enough." Henry leaned back in his bed, nodding thoughtfully. "Sounds to me like you're carrying a heavy load, Dr. Hopkins. More than just patient care, I'd say." Raymond glanced at him, debating whether to open up. But there was something about Henry, perhaps his quiet confidence, or maybe the fact that he never seemed to judge, that made Raymond feel safe to speak. "You ever feel like the game is rigged, Mr. Walton?" Raymond asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like no matter how hard you work, how much you excel, some people just see what they want to see?" Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. "I've felt that way more times than I can count, son. I've lived long enough to know when someone's being judged by a standard that's not the same for everyone else." Raymond nodded slowly. "It's not just about being a good doctor here," he continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "It's about constantly proving that I deserve to be here at all, and some days it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Henry remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of Raymond's words settle in the room. "You know, Dr. Hopkins," he said finally, "there's a saying I learned a long time ago. You don't have to attend every fight you're invited to. But sometimes you don't have a choice, and you have to stand your ground. You're in one of those fights, and I think you know it." For the first time in a long while, Raymond felt a sense of validation. Here was someone who not only saw the struggle, but understood it deeply. "I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Walton," Raymond said, his voice softening. "It's not often I feel like anyone here actually gets it." Henry's gaze was steady. There are more people who see it than you might think, Doctor. They just don't know how to speak up. And sometimes they need someone to lead the way. Raymond was taken aback by Henry's words. You mean like, what, start making noise? Challenge the system? Maybe, Henry replied, his voice calm but firm. Or maybe just start by standing firm in who you are and what you know to be true. Sometimes that's enough to make people think twice. The conversation left Raymond with a lot to think about. He had spent so much time trying to navigate the challenges of St. Luke's by keeping his head down and his work flawless. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way to push back against the injustices he faced. The next day, tensions in the hospital escalated when a critical incident occurred in the emergency room. A patient, a young woman in her 20s, was brought in with severe internal injuries following a car accident. The situation was dire, and the attending doctors had to act quickly. Dr. Allen took charge, barking orders to the surgical team, with Raymond assisting. As they prepared for surgery, Raymond noticed something troubling on the patient's scans, an abnormality that suggested internal bleeding in a location that would require a different surgical approach. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that speaking up could lead to another dressing down from Dr. Allen. But the stakes were too high. Dr. Allen, Raymond began, his voice steady but urgent. I think we need to reconsider the incision point. The scans indicate possible internal bleeding near the liver. If we don't address that first, we could lose her. Dr. Allen turned to Raymond, his face a mask of irritation. And what makes you think you know better than the rest of us, Hopkins? We're sticking to the protocol. Raymond felt the eyes of the entire team on him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to back down. With all due respect, Dr. Allen, if we go in the way you're suggesting, we might miss the source of the bleeding. I'm just thinking about the patient's best outcome. There was a moment of tense silence before Dr. Allen barked, Fine, we'll do it your way. But if this goes wrong, it's on you, Hopkins. Raymond nodded, feeling both the weight of the decision and a sense of relief. The surgery proceeded with the modified approach, and as Raymond had suspected, they found and successfully addressed the bleeding near the liver. The patient stabilized, and the procedure was a success. However, instead of acknowledging Raymond's correct judgment, Dr. Allen stormed out of the operating room without a word. The tension among the staff was palpable. Later that evening, Raymond found himself back in Henry's room, still processing the day's events. Henry, as always, was perceptive. You look like you've been through a war today, he remarked. Raymond nodded. It felt like one, he replied, recounting the surgery and the confrontation with Dr. Allen. Henry listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. Sounds to me like you did the right thing. But doing the right thing doesn't always win you friends in places like this. Raymond sighed. It's frustrating. I shouldn't have to fight this hard just to do my job. You shouldn't, Henry agreed. But sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone for a while. And sometimes that's when people start to notice who's really worth following. Raymond felt a swell of emotion, both gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. Thanks, Mr. Walton. I guess I needed to hear that. Henry's eyes softened. You're welcome, son. And remember, just because you're standing alone doesn't mean you're standing in the wrong place. The fallout from the surgery incident was swift. Dr. Allen, still seething from having his authority challenged, began to subtly escalate his campaign against Raymond. Raymond found himself assigned to even more difficult and demanding cases, often with little support or guidance. His colleagues were beginning to notice, but most kept their distance, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire between Raymond and Dr. Allen. Rumors began circulating that Raymond was too ambitious or that he didn't know his place. Raymond tried to ignore them, but the words stung. He knew he was being punished for stepping out of line, for not simply accepting the status quo. But instead of feeling defeated, Raymond began to feel a simmering anger, a determination to not let them push him out. He continued to meet with Henry regularly, finding solace in their conversations. Henry's quiet support became a lifeline, a reminder that someone believed in him. One afternoon, after another particularly grueling shift, Raymond entered Henry's room, clearly exhausted. Henry looked at him with concern. "You're wearing thin, Doctor. They're pushing you hard." Raymond nodded, sinking into the chair beside Henry's bed. "Yeah, they are. And it feels like they're just waiting for me to break." Henry was silent for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've been watching things here very closely, and I've seen enough to know that this place needs a shake-up. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one to do it." Raymond looked at him, surprised. "What are you saying, Mr. Walton?" Henry leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm saying that I have some influence, more than most people realize, and I think it's time to use it. But I need to know if you're ready for what that means." Raymond stared at him, his mind racing. "Why would you want to help me, Mr. Walton?" Henry smiled, a knowing glint in his eye. "Because I see something in you, Dr. Hopkins. I see the kind of doctor, the kind of person who can make a real difference. And I think it's time we shook things up around here." Henry's offer hung in the air, a potential turning point in Raymond's career. Raymond felt a mix of hope, fear, and uncertainty. Was he ready to take on the hospital in a way that could lead to real change? Could he trust Henry and his mysterious influence? And most importantly, was he prepared for the potential consequences? As Raymond left Henry's room that night, his mind was filled with questions, but also with a new sense of determination. He was no longer just a lone voice in a hostile environment. He had an ally, one who seemed willing to stand beside him and fight for a better future. Little did Raymond know, the events set in motion by Henry's offer would lead to a confrontation that would not only test his resolve, but also expose the deep-seated issues within St. Luke's Medical Center, setting the stage for a reckoning that was long overdue. The days that followed Henry Walton's offer of help were filled with anticipation and uncertainty for Raymond Hopkins. The air in St. Luke's Medical Center felt charged, as if a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Raymond continued his work with renewed determination, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Henry's words kept echoing in his mind, giving him both hope and a sense of impending change. The tipping point came one morning during a routine staff meeting. Dr. Allen, as usual, was leading the discussion, his tone as condescending as ever. Raymond was seated toward the back of the room, listening quietly as Dr. Allen outlined the cases for the day. "Remember, we maintain a high standard here at St. Luke's," Dr. Allen said, his eyes glancing briefly at Raymond. "And that means everyone needs to stay in their lane and follow protocol." Raymond felt a familiar wave of frustration, but he remained silent. He was used to these thinly veiled jabs. However, today, something felt different. He noticed a few of his colleagues exchanging uneasy glances. Whispers spread through the room, and Raymond caught snippets of conversation. "Did you hear about that patient?" "Yeah, apparently he's not just any patient." Before Raymond could piece together what they were talking about, the door to the meeting room swung open, and in walked Henry Walton, flanked by the hospital administrator and several board members. The room fell silent. Dr. Allen's face paled, his usual air of authority momentarily faltering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption," the administrator began, her voice unusually tense. "But we need to address something important." Henry stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room with a quiet but commanding presence. Raymond could feel the shift in the room's energy. Everyone was on edge. "Some of you may know me as a patient," Henry started, his tone steady. "But I think it's time for a proper introduction. My name is Henry Walton, former Minister of Health, and I've spent my career advocating for integrity, equality, and reform in our healthcare system." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Raymond's eyes widened. He had suspected that Henry was someone of significance, but this revelation was beyond anything he had imagined. Whispers broke out among the staff, and Dr. Allen's expression turned from confusion to barely concealed panic. Henry continued, his voice calm but resolute. "During my unplanned stay here, I've had the opportunity to see firsthand how this hospital operates. And I must say, I'm deeply troubled by what I've observed, particularly the treatment of certain staff members, the biases in decision-making, and the overall culture of exclusion that seems to permeate these halls." Raymond felt his heart rate quicken. Henry was putting everything on the line, calling out the very injustices that had plagued Raymond since he arrived at St. Luke's. The room was so silent that one could hear a pin drop. The hospital administrator cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Walton, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. If there have been any misunderstandings or issues—" Henry cut her off, his voice gaining a sharper edge. "I'm not here to discuss misunderstandings. I'm here to address what I've seen. A talented young doctor, Dr. Raymond Hopkins, being undermined, marginalized, and subjected to a double standard that has no place in any professional setting." Raymond felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, validation, and a newfound resolve. For so long he had felt like he was fighting this battle alone. But now, in front of the entire hospital leadership, his struggles were being laid bare. Dr. Allen, his face flushed with anger, tried to regain control. "Mr. Walton, with all due respect, you don't understand the complexities of our work here. Dr. Hopkins is a new resident, and like any other, he is subject to the same rigorous standards." "Enough," Henry interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I've seen more than enough to know that your so-called standards are selectively applied, and I have no intention of letting this go unchecked." The tension in the room was palpable as Henry turned his attention to the board members. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone firm and unyielding. "I'm calling for a full investigation into the practices here at St. Luke's. I want to see how decisions are made, how opportunities are allocated, and how complaints of discrimination are handled. And I expect transparency, nothing swept under the rug." The hospital administrator tried to interject, but Henry continued, his voice rising with authority. "And as for Dr. Allen," he said, turning to face the senior surgeon directly, "I'm requesting that his conduct be thoroughly reviewed. The way he's treated Dr. Hopkins, and likely others, is not only unprofessional, but potentially dangerous to patient care." Dr. Allen's face turned beet red, his hands clenched at his sides. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "You have no right." "I have every right," Henry countered sharply. "And I have the means to make sure this place gets the scrutiny it deserves. So, I suggest you start cooperating." Raymond watched the scene unfold with a mix of astonishment and vindication. His colleagues, many of whom had remained silent or complicit in the face of the hospital's toxic culture, now looked visibly uncomfortable. Some avoided his gaze. Others seemed to be reevaluating their own roles in the status quo. The hospital board, sensing the gravity of the situation, began to murmur among themselves. One of the board members, an older man with a stern face, spoke up. "Mr. Walton, we understand your concerns, and we assure you that we will take immediate action to address these issues. We'll begin with a comprehensive review." "I expect nothing less," Henry replied, his expression steely. "And know that I will be following this closely. This isn't just about one doctor. It's about the integrity of this entire institution." The meeting ended in a flurry of whispers and tense exchanges. As the staff began to disperse, Raymond remained in his seat, still processing the weight of what had just happened. He had not expected Henry to take such a bold stand, and now the entire hospital was on notice. As word of the meeting spread throughout the hospital, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Some staff members who had previously ignored or dismissed Raymond now approached him with tentative smiles or nods, clearly trying to gauge where the winds were blowing. Others, particularly those who had been close to Dr. Allen, looked at him with a mixture of resentment and fear. Raymond knew this was only the beginning. He had no illusions that things would change overnight. But there was a newfound sense of hope, a sense that justice was finally within reach. He continued to see patients, perform his duties, and interact with colleagues. But now he carried himself with a quiet confidence, bolstered by the knowledge that he wasn't alone. Later that day, as Raymond walked down the hallway, he overheard two nurses talking in hushed tones. "Did you see the way Allen reacted? He looked like he was going to explode," one of them said. "I know. And who knew that patient was a former minister of health? No wonder he had the guts to stand up to them," the other replied. Raymond felt a small smile tug at his lips. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was time to see how they would grow. That evening, Raymond went to visit Henry in his room. Henry was sitting up in bed, looking tired but satisfied. "Quite a day, huh?" he remarked as Raymond entered. Raymond nodded, still trying to wrap his head around everything. "I didn't realize who you were, Mr. Walton. I mean, I knew you were someone important, but—" Henry chuckled. "I've always found it best to keep a low profile when you want to see what's really going on. And let me tell you, Dr. Hopkins, what I have seen here has been both eye-opening and infuriating." "Why did you do it?" Raymond asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Why put yourself on the line for someone like me?" Henry's expression softened. "Because I've spent my life fighting for equity and justice in healthcare, and I'm not about to stop now. You remind me of myself when I was younger, determined, talented, and not willing to back down. But you shouldn't have to fight this fight alone. No one should." Raymond felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Henry nodded. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to be done, and it won't be easy. But I believe in you, Raymond. I believe you can lead this change." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, investigations, and tense conversations. The hospital leadership, now under intense scrutiny from both the public and the medical community, scrambled to address the issues that Henry had brought to light. They launched diversity and inclusion training programs, began a thorough review of hiring and promotion practices, and started to overhaul the hospital's culture. Dr. Allen, who had been the focal point of much of the criticism, was put on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. The news sent shockwaves through the hospital. For years, he had been untouchable. Now, he was facing consequences for his actions. Raymond found himself in a new position. He was no longer just another resident trying to keep his head down. He had become a symbol of resistance against a flawed system, and more importantly, he had gained the support of someone who could help make real, lasting changes. As the hospital began to transform under the pressure of Henry's demands, Raymond felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging and filled with resistance from those who clung to the old ways. But he also knew that change was possible, and that he had both the courage and the allies needed to see it through. Henry's unexpected intervention had set the wheels in motion, but the real work was just beginning. And Raymond was ready to be at the forefront of that change, ready to fight for a future where every doctor, nurse, and patient was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The storm that Henry Walton had unleashed upon St. Luke's Medical Center was far from over. While the initial shock of his true identity and bold demands had sent ripples throughout the hospital, the real challenge was only beginning. Raymond Hopkins, now at the center of the whirlwind, found himself thrust into a new role, not just as a doctor, but as a leader and a voice for change. The hospital administration, under intense pressure from both the media and the medical community, scrambled to respond to Henry's call for reform. Over the next few days, a series of emergency meetings were held to address the issues that had been brought to light. The atmosphere in the hospital was tense, with everyone from senior doctors to the newest interns feeling the weight of what was at stake. Raymond attended several of these meetings, invited by the hospital board to share his experiences and insights. For the first time, he found himself sitting at the table with people who were usually far above his station. The room was filled with influential figures, board members, department heads, and even representatives from healthcare advocacy groups who had been brought in to consult on the proposed changes. Henry, of course, was there as well, sitting quietly at one end of the table, his presence a constant reminder of why they were all gathered. Raymond felt a mixture of nerves and determination as he looked around the room, knowing that his words could help shape the future of the hospital. One of the board members, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up. "Dr. Hopkins, we'd like to hear from you directly. What changes do you think are necessary to ensure that St. Luke's is an inclusive and fair workplace for all its staff?" Raymond took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I think the first step is to acknowledge that there's a problem," he began. "We need transparency in how decisions are made, especially when it comes to assignments, promotions, and disciplinary actions. There should be a clear, unbiased process that everyone can trust." He paused, gauging the reactions around the table. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked wary. "We also need to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion training, not just as a checkbox exercise, but as an ongoing commitment to understanding and addressing biases that exist within our institution." Henry nodded approvingly from his seat, his gaze steady on Raymond. The board members exchanged glances, and the woman who had asked the question leaned forward. "And what about accountability?" she asked. "How do we ensure that people are held responsible when they fail to meet these standards?" Raymond didn't hesitate. There needs to be a system in place where complaints of discrimination or unfair treatment are taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. No more sweeping things under the rug or ignoring problems until they go away. The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Finally, the chairman of the board, an older man with a stern face, nodded. "I think we've all heard enough to know that we have a lot of work to do," he said. "We'll begin drafting new policies immediately and work with external experts to implement these changes. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins, for your candor." Over the next few weeks, the hospital began to undergo a series of significant transformations. The first and most visible change was the introduction of mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, from the top executives to the janitorial team. The sessions were led by external consultants who specialized in addressing systemic biases within organizations. Raymond, who was now seen as a key advocate for these changes, participated actively in the training sessions, not just as a learner but as a facilitator. He shared his experiences, spoke about the challenges he faced, and encouraged others to reflect on their own biases and behaviors. The response was mixed. Some staff members were receptive, recognizing that they had much to learn and unlearn. Others were more resistant, seeing the training as a waste of time or an attack on their character. Raymond knew this wouldn't be easy, But he also knew it was necessary. The hospital also began to overhaul its hiring and promotion practices. A new committee was formed, composed of diverse members from various departments, to ensure that all decisions were fair and transparent. Raymond was asked to serve on this committee, a role that he accepted with both pride and a sense of responsibility. As the weeks went by, Raymond could feel the culture at St. Luke's beginning to shift, albeit slowly. Colleagues who had previously ignored him or treated him with thinly veiled disdain now approached him with a different attitude, some with genuine curiosity and interest, others with tentative apologies. One day, while Raymond was grabbing a cup of coffee in the break room, Nurse Jessica, who had once been cold and dismissive, approached him. "Hey, Dr. Hopkins," she said, her voice a bit hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if I ever made you feel unwelcome here. I realize now that I've been part of the problem." Raymond turned to her, surprised but appreciative. "Thank you, Jessica," he said. "It takes a lot to acknowledge that, and I'm glad you did. This isn't just about me, it's about making sure no one else has to feel that way either." She nodded, and for the first time, Raymond felt that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. The investigation into Dr. Allen's conduct was thorough and comprehensive. Interviews were conducted with numerous staff members, many of whom had witnessed his discriminatory behavior firsthand, but had been too afraid to speak up. With Henry's intervention, however, the atmosphere had shifted enough to embolden people to come forward. The findings were damning. Not only had Dr. Allen routinely undermined and dismissed the contributions of doctors and nurses of color, but he had also created a toxic environment that discouraged any form of dissent or innovation that didn't align with his narrow view of how things should be done. The hospital board, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, decided to terminate Dr. Allen's employment. The news spread quickly through the hospital, sending a clear message that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. Raymond couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. While he didn't take pleasure in anyone losing their job, he knew that this was a necessary step for the hospital to move forward. The system needed to be cleansed of its most toxic elements if there was ever going to be real, lasting change. With Dr. Allen gone and the hospital undergoing significant reforms, Raymond found himself stepping into a new role as an unofficial leader of change. He was invited to speak at several medical conferences about the experience at St. Luke's and the importance of addressing systemic biases in healthcare institutions. At these conferences, Raymond didn't hold back. He spoke candidly about the challenges he faced, the resistance to change, and the importance of allyship from people like Henry Walton, who had the power and the platform to make a difference. His speeches were met with applause, and he found himself gaining recognition beyond the walls of St. Luke's. Back at the hospital, Raymond continued his work as a doctor, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He formed a mentorship program for new residents, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, to provide the support he wished he had when he first arrived. He also worked closely with the hospital's new diversity committee to develop policies that would ensure fair treatment and equal opportunities for all. One evening, Raymond visited Henry in his room to update him on the progress. Henry, who had been recovering well, greeted him with a smile. "You're becoming quite the leader around here, Dr. Hopkins," he said. Raymond chuckled. "I'm just doing what needs to be done, Mr. Walton. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Henry shook his head. "I just gave you a nudge. The rest was all you. And don't think for a second that this is the end. There's still a long way to go. Not just here, but in every hospital, every institution." Raymond nodded. "I know, but at least now I feel like we're heading in the right direction." Henry's smile widened. "That's the spirit. Keep pushing, keep speaking up, and never forget why you started. As Raymond left Henry's room, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had allies, a voice, and a platform. And most importantly, he had the resolve to continue fighting for a more equitable and just healthcare system. The changes at St. Luke's were just the beginning. There would be resistance, setbacks, and challenges ahead, but Raymond was ready to face them head-on. With the strength of his convictions and the support of those who believed in him, he knew that anything was possible. And so, the transformation of St. Luke's Medical Center began. A transformation not just of policies and practices, but of hearts and minds. It would take time, effort, and persistence, but Raymond was committed to seeing it through, one day at a time, until every patient, doctor, and nurse could walk through those halls with their heads held high, knowing they belonged. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comments. Your opinion matters to us. Don't forget to check out other videos on our channel. More exciting and unexpected stories are waiting for you there. See you soon.